Well, I would like to introduce Robert to you now, Robert Karp. We have had him with us a few times now already. I personally met Robert in the 90s, in the 1990s, when he was working for Practical Farmers of Iowa, and subsequently he became the executive director of the Biodynamic Association in the US. And we have been working for a while now together in the Agriculture Section Council. And Robert has a great interest in social question. I'm always amazed how he looks at things, and he has done some interesting work with looking at the question of social questions of that are coming up these days, racial questions, and a lot more. And he's also now having a Substack, so you can find him there as well. And we're very excited that today he will speak to us about preparing for the year 2033. I will not say more, but Robert will say it all. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Harald. I just want to try to I'm going to set my screen so that I see you and not me. There we go. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here with all of you and share some of my research, some of my work. It's always, for those of you who give presentations, you know that it's a gift for you because it gives you the opportunity to really deepen everything that you're living with and working with and bring it into form in a certain way. And I just have to mention that this topic's been living with me a long time, and it's so vast that I've actually prepared 3 talks on this topic. And so tonight, I'll just be bringing the kind of overview. And then for those of you who are interested, I'll be offering in the course of the month of April 2 other talks to build on this talk tonight. And I'll be announcing the times and everything on my website. So at the end of this talk, I'll put my website in the chat in case if you haven't subscribed to my website. That way you'll get the announcement for these additional talks. So I just want to begin by acknowledging something I think we're all feeling very intensively, and that is the incredible rapid pace of change that's taking place within human evolution at this time. It's just an extraordinary feeling that the human being, the earth, social structures, geopolitical structures, everything is going through profound change, a profound, you could say, metamorphosis. And this radical change could awaken a question in us about anthroposophy, right? It could awaken a question along the lines of, geez, what's going to happen to anthroposophy in the coming years when the world is changing so radically? But I'd like to suggest that in a certain way, that's not the right question. That the question we really have to ask ourselves is, how can anthroposophy itself go through a metamorphosis so that it can serve what humanity is in the process of becoming? Right? Anthroposophy is not an end in itself. We're here to serve the human beings of our time. And if the human beings of our time are going through radical change, that suggests that anthroposophy itself has to become something quite new, that a kind of rebirth. you could even say, of anthroposophy needs to take place, and in certain ways is clearly taking place. And we see this, quite clearly at the level of the daughter movements. We see how there's a kind of death and rebirth process happening in Waldorf education, in biodynamic agriculture and anthroposophical medicine and so on. There's a real intensity right now of trying to find the pathway for spiritual science into the future. Again, not so that we can somehow hold on and preserve what we have. It's not necessarily a bad goal, but so that we can become what we need to become for humanity. And it's my belief that the years from 2000 to 2033 represent a very, very significant time for this transformation. And we're now living in the final 7 years of this 33-year arc, right? This Easter, which we've just passed 3 days ago, we are now 7 years from Easter 2033. And so what I want to do is just lay a very basic foundation. Why 2033? Why is that significant? Why is this arc from 2000 to 2033 significant? We'll also be looking at the 100-year arc of 1933 to 2033. Why are these dates, why is this time period so significant? Because what interests me is that to the degree to which our community can come to shared pictures, shared imaginations for what we and all of humanity are going through in these years, those shared pictures will allow us to do important spiritual work in these years. But we need some common understanding. So I'd like to start, and I'm going to share slides. I hope you're all okay with that. I need to share my screen. Sorry, let me go into share. Can you all see my slideshow at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I can't hear you, but I think I see nodding, so I'm going to proceed.
Yes.
Okay, I imagine many of you are aware of this book, published many years ago now. This was a facsimile of the original Calendar of the Soul, which was published in the year 1912. And what many of you may not know is that what today we know as the Calendar of the Soul, which are these 52 verses, was actually just one part of a much larger, more ambitious book that included a full-on calendar of each month and new zodiacal images that Rudolf Steiner created. And it's just loaded with kind of fresh, new impulses and perspectives. Here's a kind of close-up of the actual cover. And the first thing we need to attend to here when we look at this cover is that even though this is published in 1912, it refers to the year 1879 on the cover. So the translation of the cover is in the year 1879 after the birth of the eye. And this is because Rudolf Steiner points out in this calendar that if we wanted to create a calendar that actually reflected the universal dimension of humanity, rather than a particular cultural perspective, that calendar would need to begin not at the time of the birth of Jesus, but actually at the death and resurrection of Christ, which took place in the year 33 AD, according to Rudolf Steiner and many biblical scholars, certainly not all. But Rudolf Steiner pointed to the year 33 AD, and he says, if we wanted to create a truly universal calendar, we would need to begin it in the year 33. And this is why, even though this calendar is published in the year 1912, it refers to 1879 on the cover. And so, again, just so you can see it visually a little bit, Rudolf Steiner is saying we have the birth of Jesus, but then we have the death and resurrection of Christ. And so from this perspective, in the first place, it's fairly straightforward to say that the end of the 20th century, from an esoteric perspective, from a universal perspective, is actually in the year 2033. And that the end of the 20th century that took place in the year 2000 was not at all insignificant, but it was associated far more with the being of Jesus. And Rudolf Steiner is not suggesting that this birth date of Jesus is insignificant. As you know, he devoted much of his life to articulating all the extraordinary preparation and interweaving of spiritual streams and spiritual beings that went into, the birth and development of this being we call Jesus. But nonetheless, Jesus remains a figure associated with a particular culture. Whereas the Christ being that Jesus became the vessel of in the year 30 AD, and who then was born into the earth, as Rudolf Steiner describes it, at the crucifixion and resurrection, this being is of universal character. And we can just think, for example, of how many times Rudolf Steiner said something to the effect that, yes, it was certainly necessary historically that a church be formed around the coming of Christ, that it really was not the mission of Christ to found a church among other churches. This was a preliminary phase. The mission of the Christ being is to bring about a universal culture among all the religions of the earth, among all the cultures and peoples, all the different spiritual streams. The Christ is working in every spiritual stream on the earth, in every single human being, to move us toward this quality of a universal culture. And so, but again, this doesn't make the year 2000 insignificant, because if we realize that Jesus was the vessel for the Christ, then we can see that these years between 2000 and 2033 are actually connected to this mystery of the formation of a vessel for the being of Christ. There's a kind of repetition and metamorphosis taking place of the mystery of what took place between the birth of Jesus and the baptism and then the death and resurrection. So that's the first picture I just wanted to bring, which I'm sure many of you are aware, maybe not all of you. I just wanted to bring this picture, why 2033 might be significant. But I'm going to go on now to another picture. And this is connected to what people sometimes call the new Christ rhythm. So Rudolf Steiner points out that this 33-year life of Christ is now a new formative rhythm working within human civilization, working within the cosmos, right? Just as we have various rhythms connected to the periodicities of the planets, various cycles, but now he says this rhythm of 33 years connected to the life of Christ has become very significant. And I'll just point out a little conundrum that I've discovered doing this research, which is that when Rudolf Steiner gives this indication, on the one hand, he speaks of it as 33 years. So that would make this rhythm, as it cycles through a period of time, 33 years, 66 years, 99 years. But he also refers to the end of those three cycles as 100 years. So that has led a number of people to the thought that perhaps this rhythm is actually 33 1/3 years. And there's actually several people who believe that the life of Christ actually was 33 1/3 years long. But be that as it may, I'm not going to address this very mild, philosophical question. But what's important to know is that Rudolf Steiner depicts this rhythm in two very different ways. On the one hand, it's like a rhythmic pulsing and expansion of the Christ impulse, starting at the original Easter. This evolutionary, metamorphosing, growing impulse. That's the one way to think of it. But Rudolf Steiner then also says, basically, to simplify it, whenever a Christian deed has been performed on earth, a truly Christian deed. And Rudolf Steiner, it's beautiful in the lectures, he says, that could be as simple as someone making a pair of shoes for another human being, because that's a social deed. Or it could be something far more lofty, but wherever a truly Christian deed is performed, then it sets in motion a 33-year cycle in which that deed will come to fulfillment. After 33, then after 66, and then a kind of completion after 100 years, where there's a kind of new step that has to be made. And just to give you an example of this, whoops, now my screen is not moving. Let's try again. There we go. Well, here, first of all, this is just, you can see if we take the first example of this rhythm, right? Moving through the history of humanity, right? Every 33 or 33 1/3 years, we have this pulsing of the Christ impulse. But we can also take it in connection with a particular date, such as the beginning of the age of Michael, which Rudolf Steiner indicated as 1879. And then we can come to this discovery, perhaps this is another reason why Rudolf Steiner considered 1912 to be so important, right? When this calendar of the soul was published, because it was actually exactly 33 years from 1879, when Michael becomes the time spirit. So here you can see that you can also take the 33-year rhythm from a very significant deed and follow it through time. So this rhythm of 3 times 33 and a third years points to a big significance then to the 100-year rhythm. And I'd like to take a moment and just at the end of this talk, I'll come back to it quite a bit, but to suggest a very profound significance in this relationality between 1933 and 2033. And I'm just going to give you a few of the events of 1933 that I think we are living now as we move towards 2033, toward the question of how these events of 1933 are going to go through a new metamorphosis. But for the moment, I'm just going to point to 4 aspects of 1933. My computer just froze up again. 1 second. First of all, we have to recognize that the 30s, Rudolf Steiner, the 30s is when Christ would reappear in the etheric world. He gives a number of dates. He says the year 1933 would be important, the year 1935, the year 1937. A number of spiritual researchers have come to the conclusion that this historic, universally significant event actually began in 1933. And I'm not going to go in to the background of all of that, but after living with many different descriptions and Rudolf Steiner's writings, I myself believe that this is accurate, that 1933 was the pivotal date in the resurrection of Christ in the etheric world, you could say, the appearance of Christ in the etheric world. The second thing that took place in 1933 was incredible fragmentation among the leadership and membership of the Anthroposophical Society. At that time, I don't know how many of you have studied the incredible tensions that were taking place in the years after Rudolf Steiner died. And this led 2 years later in 1935 to the breakup of the original leadership group, or Vorstand. And this came to a head in 1933, even though the expulsions didn't happen till 35. The tensions erupted in such a way that everybody could see it. And of course, it didn't only lead to the breakup of the Vorstand, it led to several national societies separating from the Dornach Society. And this coming to a head had a lot to do with the third aspect of this tableau of 1933, and that is the coming to power of Hitler in Germany, which really, really brought these tensions in the society out in a significant way, because after all, how was the society going to respond? And it made very clear that there was no ability to come to a unified picture. And the last thing I'd like to suggest that's significant in this tableau is what I'm simply going to call here the conspicuous absence of Rudolf Steiner on Earth, who would have turned 72 years old, a kind of archetypal age in 1933. And I think it's very clear to most people now that Rudolf Steiner died a premature death. And I won't enter into that topic now, except that when I think of this tableau of 33, it's necessary to include, how can I say, the presence of his absence at that moment and what that meant for the sort of breaking apart of the Anthroposophical Society at that time. So I'm going to come back to this tableau at the end of the talk. For now, I just kind of wanted to place it in the room to have you hear it and see it, and we'll come back to it. So again, this is another rhythm, not only the 2000 to 2033, but a 100-year rhythm from 1933 to 2033 that I think is very significant. And now I'm going to turn to a third indication that I think throws extraordinary light on 2033 and on these questions. But maybe I'll just pause here for a moment and just see, are there any questions or comments from anything that I have shared so far? I just want to not download too much information here. If anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment. Yes. Oh, that's Rose clapping her hands. I'm not sure are you trying to raise your hand, Rose? No.
I'm raising my hand.
Oh, okay, Clifford. Excellent. I couldn't see you. Yep.
Yes. This makes me wonder if you might be talking about presumably there would be importance to what happened between the years of 1925 at Steiner's death and 1933 at the Advent, and possibly a relationship between what happens between 2025 and 2033. Is that something you might be talking about and have in mind, or do you think it's relevant here? Okay.
Yes, because that is roughly comparable to this 7-year period we're in now. I mean, that's an 8-year period, but I believe that we're in that echo now. And it's, extraordinarily significant from my standpoint. And I'll be coming back to it at the end of the talk. Okay. I'm going to press on. I'm going to share my screen again. And now I'm going to bring an indication that does not come directly from Rudolf Steiner, but it's an indication that I believe is enormously significant and that echoes much of what Rudolf Steiner brought. But I think it's very helpful. And let's just remember in the first place that Rudolf Steiner describes the life of Christ on earth when Christ was united with Jesus, starting at the baptism. He describes that as like a conception and a kind of period of pregnancy, which leads to the birth, as I showed you, as he said earlier in the calendar of the soul, the birth of the I, right? So Rudolf Steiner is already pointing to the notion that there's a developmental rhythm, a developmental process of the Christ impulse. And there's an indication about this developmental rhythm that comes originally from an Italian anthroposophist named Pietro Archiati. Maybe some of you know his books. He's a very, I think, wonderful writer. Although this indication is not in his books. So I still don't really understand where he got it. But at some point, he shared it with the astrosopher Robert Powell. And Robert put it in a book that he published over 30 years ago. And he put it in the appendix of the book. And it's a book that turned out to be extremely controversial. So what that means is that like very few people are even aware of this indication, because Archiati, to my knowledge in English, never publishes it. And only a small group of people who have, a sympathy with Robert Powell's work are aware of this indication that shows up in the appendix to his book. And I know that, yeah, for some people, Robert Powell is a controversial figure. I'm not here tonight to promote his work or detract his work. I've known Robert a long time, but we have our own perspectives on many things. But in this case, I've now lived with this indication for over 30 years, and I think it's of enormous significance. And the basic indication is this. The idea is that 100 years in the life of humanity since the mystery of Golgotha in AD 33 equals 1 year of development for the Christ impulse. So in other words, from this perspective, the first 700 years after the original Easter can be seen as a kind of 0 to 7 phase in the biography of the Christ impulse. And the second 700 years as a kind of 7 to 14 maturation in the biography of the Christ impulse. And the third 700 years leading up to the year 2133 can be seen as a kind of 14 to 21 phase in the biography of the Christ impulse. And so we could also say from this perspective, the Christ impulse will turn 20 on 2033 and will turn 21 in the year 2133. And as we know, in human life, when we turn 1, it means we've completed our first year and we are now beginning our second year. So really, this year 2033, from this perspective, is the beginning of the 21st year of the Christ impulse. And you'll just have to live with this indication in the way I have. But to me, it has become so illuminating because it's so clear that there's a new form of Christianity that's been trying to emerge, that is trying to emerge, and it's connected to the self. It's like the higher self. And whereas what we've seen through the last these 700-year cycles is a kind of preparation, the Christ impulse working through the sheaths, you could say, in the way a child works through the sheaths. And you could say, is there any evidence for the reality of this indication other than Robert Karp telling you that he's lived with it a long time? And it's very illuminating, but you have to live with it. But it's good to know that Rudolf Steiner himself gave a very similar developmental picture in his lectures on the principle of spiritual economy. in which he speaks of Christianity evolving through the bestowal of the physical, etheric, and astral replicas of the Christ. If you're not familiar with this lecture or this lecture series, it's highly recommended. But he himself speaks, he doesn't use the same time sequence that Archiati and Paula use, slightly different, but he's pointing to a very similar reality, a physical phase, an etheric phase, an astral phase, and now in our time, a phase connected to the I. And I thought I would just read you a passage from Rudolf Steiner in this lecture, where he says, "For this is the course of human evolution." For this is the course of Christian evolution. Propagation on the physical plane, then through etheric bodies, and then through astral bodies that by and large were reincarnated astral bodies of Jesus. Now the time is at hand when the ego nature of Christ will increasingly light up in human beings as the innermost essence of their souls. Yes, these imprinted copies of the Christ Jesus individuality are waiting to be taken in by human souls. They are waiting! Exclamation. So you can see here something very similar being pointed to by Rudolf Steiner. But then if we unpack this a little bit, we can see a reflection, right? In this first 700 years, after the flourishing of an incredibly diverse, heterodox Christian culture, gradually we have this consolidation of Roman Catholicism, a papal authority, which is often referred to as the Peterine stream or the will stream of exoteric Christianity. And then in the next 700 years, first of all, we have the schism with the Eastern Church, which leads to Orthodox Christianity, which many people call the Johannine, or the feeling stream of exoteric Christianity. But we also see this feeling element reflected in the development of Christianity in the West, right? The transition from the Romanesque fortress-like architecture to the Gothic, and the spread of Christian monasticism and Marian devotion. But eventually this incredible flourishing of medieval Christianity begins to become corrupted. And this leads then to the third phase, the rise of Protestantism, or what is often called the Pauline or thinking stream of exoteric Christianity, based on an impulse of rebellion and a quest for freedom of belief. Is this sounding anything like adolescence to you? The spread of Christianity around the world through the printing press, the voyages of discovery, the emergence of modern science, materialism, that began to wear away at the vitality of Christianity. And it's also remarkable to notice, if we look at evolution through this particular time frame, that this 14 to 21 year period coincides with almost exactly with the beginning of the consciousness soul age. So I think there's actually quite a lot here. And we could also look at it another way, more through the lens of esoteric Christianity. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I would suggest that we could look back and see a connection with the deeds of Parsifal and what we know of as the 9-year change that happens in the human being, and the school of Chartres in connection with the age around 11, 12. This is all classical evolution of consciousness perspective, but it's a somewhat different slant because we're looking now at a kind of adolescence taking place in the age of the consciousness soul. So it has a particular character, and probably you all know that adolescence in our time has a very particular character. There's never really been in the history of humanity anything like what we call adolescence. So, but let me point to something else that to me is a remarkable indication of this indication from Archiati. We all know that the first nodal return in the life of an individual takes place at approximately 18.61 years. What is the nodal return? We could have Brian tell us all about it. But this is when the position of the lunar nodes come back to where they were at the moment of birth. And this is known both in traditional astrology and astrosophy as a very important awakening of the eye. The eye is beginning to come in, right? At around 18.6 years, the eye is beginning to come in. Now, if we apply the principle I just spoke about, multiply 18.61 by 10, we get the year 1861. And this is the year that Rudolf Steiner was born. So Rudolf Steiner, from a certain perspective, we can see him as an expression of the first nodal return of the Christ impulse. And yet that timing of 1861 is timed to the birth of Jesus. Well, what happens 33 years later, friends? The publication of the Philosophy of Freedom, the philosophical foundations for a new Christianity based on the freedom and dignity of the individual human being. So you see here, this principle I tried to bring earlier of the relationship of 2000 to 2033 in terms of the vessel and what fills the vessel. We see this reflected in an incredibly powerful way in Rudolf Steiner's own life, that he's born in 1861, and 33 years later, he publishes the Philosophy of Freedom, this foundational work for all of anthroposophy and for, the emergence of the of a Christianity of the eye. So again, I don't want to dwell a long time on this, but for me, this indication points in a very significant way to 2033 is not simply the end of the millennium, the end of the 20th century, but it's really what we're really dealing with is the Christ impulse itself coming of age. We could think for a moment of the chapter 12 of the book of Revelation. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon was under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And being with child, she cried out in her travail and was in the anguish of delivery. And another sign was seen in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his head 7 diadems. And his tail was dragging along a third part of the stars of heaven, and it dashed them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bring forth, that when she had brought forth, he might devour her son. And she brought forth all nations with a rod of iron. So one way we could picture this woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and the crown of stars, this is, you could say, the soul of humanity, the soul of all that has been contributed in Christian evolution up to this moment to bring in the higher self, the true self of Christianity. So briefly, I just want to touch on this picture then, because you can see that from the standpoint of the picture of evolution that Rudolf Steiner gives in occult science, we're in the consciousness soul age. And if we translate that to human biography, that suggests that, very broadly speaking, humanity as a whole is roughly 37 years old right now. But I'm suggesting it from the perspective of the Christ impulse. You could also say that humanity is about to turn 20, is about to begin our 21st year. And these two, so you could say each of us in a way have 3 ages. We have our individual biographical age. We have our age connected to the phase of evolution we're in now, the age of the consciousness soul. And then we could say we have our age in relation to the Christ impulse. And Rudolf Steiner touches on this fact of this discrepancy very powerfully, because the significance of the age of the consciousness soul, and the reason I've drawn it this way with the downward arrow, what does he say about this biographical period? He says this is when all the instincts and enthusiasms and passions that we came into life with through childhood and our early life, they come to an end. And only through an inner effort can we attain what he calls achieved idealism. Everything has come to naught. We have to rise to a new self. And clearly, this is what's taking place civilizationally. Let me read you a few words. Again, from Rudolf Steiner. Before the second coming, all that remains of the old must be driven to nullity. The human being must find his full freedom out of the nothingness, and the new insight must give itself birth out of this nothingness, out of this nullity. And then he says something quite remarkable about the necessary conditions for an experience of Christ in the etheric. He says this will be the solution of the most significant disharmony that has ever arisen in earth existence. the disharmony between the human being's feeling as an earthly being and his knowledge that he is a super earthly being, a cosmic being. The fulfillment of this longing will prepare man to recognize how, out of gray spiritual depths, the Christ being will reveal himself to him and will speak to him spiritually. Just as at the time of the mystery of Golgotha, he spoke to him physically. The Christ will not come in the spirit if human beings are not prepared for him. But they can be prepared by sensing this discrepancy, by sensing the schism weighing terribly heavily upon them. So this is a certain picture of our souls right now that Rudolf Steiner is saying we're each living with this tension that, but you could say, put simply, between our lower selves and our higher selves. Or as I put it here, between our earthly I am and this Christ I am, which is full of youthful vigor, that wants to lead us into the future, and this natural evolution that actually has no future in it. And this is, let me just make sure I have this. Yes. So think about it. This is a beautiful picture of the stages of evolution given by Rudolf Steiner in Occult Science, drawn by Brooke Delorme. Really wonderful person with a wonderful Substack. But here you can see the whole passage from old Saturn to future Vulcan. Here you can see the future Earth. The present Earth. And down here you can see our time. And think about it. Rudolf Steiner didn't give us this imagination because the future ages were foregone conclusions. He gave us this picture because there's none of these future ages will happen unless some group of human beings wills them. We must will these future stages for them to be possible. You could say a seed of the 10th hierarchy must arise in our time. So there's a task here to not go downhill with our physical, biological, consciousness, soul nature, but to rise into our Christ nature. And you could say it's this nullity of the consciousness soul that makes it possible for us to have an I-thou relation to Christ, because we're now have the possibility to meet Christ, not just through our sheaths, right? This is what the consciousness soul period is all about. The sheaths fall away, and we can finally encounter one another and other beings in a kind of direct act of cognition. So I'm going to come back to this reality now that we're 7 years from Easter 2033. It's remarkable, to note that this Easter we just experienced took place on April 5th, which was the date of the original Easter. Christ was crucified on April 3rd and resurrected on April 5th. And every once in a while, I don't know the periodicity, we have an Easter that's archetypally connected to those dates. In 2033, we will be at April 17th. And of course, in this whole framework, Easter 2030 is also of enormous significance, which will take place on April 21st. So I'd like to pause again because I'm going to bring a closing imagination about, related to these 7 years and related to the 1933 tableau. But I would like to pause again. Let me just see what's here. Yep, I'd like to pause again and just see if there are any questions or comments that you want to share before we go on. And I'm trying to figure out, there we go. How do I stop?
It would help if you would, use the share, the react button to raise your hand. Then we could definitely know you.
Yeah, if you use the raise hand feature under reactions, that will help.
Rose.
Okay, Rose.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for this incredible presentation so far. I'm stuck on a couple of things, and I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about the significance of the Dominican order and why that was significant.
Yes, so the Dominicans had a task because the thinking of humanity was beginning to become more earthly. This, we see, really took off beginning in the 15th century, the development of modern science, but it was already beginning to come in the 13th and 14th century. And the Dominican order had a mission to develop a Christian form of thinking that could help lift up the materialistic thinking that was coming. And so, if we just look at the work of Thomas Aquinas, we see that this reworking of Aristotle that he did, had a huge impact on Christian evolution at that time and really helped lay the ground for the whole way the Catholic Church began to enter into this new phase, this adolescent phase, I would say. Whereas I would describe the Cistercian order and again the school of Chartres as having a little more of this Platonic gesture of kind of bringing the ancient wisdom into a Christian form, whereas the Dominicans had more a task to enter into intellectual thought and begin to lift it up. Is that a sufficient answer for the moment, Rose?
Yeah, that's a sufficient answer for the moment. I do have some follow-up questions about it, but that might actually be something done over email instead. But other people might benefit from these as well, because
yeah, go ahead if you have another question.
Oh, well, so the Franciscans, I feel like I'm digressing out of your stream here with my questions. So, I think I'm finding this talk about the Dominicans and what their spiritual goals were. And then I have a strong Franciscan background personally. So I think my parents were both Franciscans and both buried in Franciscan habit, which is very rare.
Wow.
So yeah. So anyway, perhaps this is a much bigger question than we can handle here. So
okay.
thank you.
And Clifford has
Fair
his
enough.
hand up. Yeah, Robert.
Pardon me?
Clifford has his hand up.
Okay, Clifford. Yeah, go ahead.
There we go. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Thought I'd try again. Luigi Morelli, are you familiar with Luigi Morelli? He's done
Yes.
some writing and whatever, and he spent some time pointing towards Alcoholics Anonymous and Bill Wilson, and Bill Wilson had his big Christ light experience in
Yes.
1934, just as at the dawn of the Advent. And how have you thought about his placement in the whole order of things, so to speak? I mean, to me, that's like a kind of a first shot over the bow, it seems, for the the reappearance of the Christ in the etheric. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, I'm in total agreement with Luigi's perspective about the significance of Bill Wilson's Christ experience. I think it's archetypally an expression of what I just read from Rudolf Steiner. I mean, if you really read his story and the desperation and this inability, this feeling of powerlessness, and I think yeah, I think there's no question that this Christ experience has taken place for many human beings on the planet. Perhaps not as many as Rudolf Steiner hoped. And there's a whole debate in anthroposophical literature about to what degree the second coming took place in the form that Rudolf Steiner hoped. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next section. But I think Bill Wilson and Alcoholics Anonymous and that whole movement is undoubtedly an expression of the working of the Christ impulse in humanity right now. Yeah. Loanne, go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah. I've worked with the 33-year rhythm with a 500-year history of the North American continent. And I kept looking. Now, I'm certainly not adequate in what I was attempting, but when I took the 33-year rhythm and come back 500 years and coming forth, and also bringing it from the time you talked about of 33 AD, coming up to 1933 and looking at what happened on our continent, we come to the Depression, and we come to the time when Franklin Roosevelt tried to do something for the situation on our continent in the United States. I just wanted to bring that into the picture of our history.
Beautiful. Thank you, Loanne. Yeah, I mean, I think part of this metamorphosis that anthroposophy itself is trying to go through in these years has to do with really individualizing anthroposophy and anchoring anthroposophy within the ethos and history of our different places on Earth. And I think there's just huge stories of the spiritual history of North America that haven't been fully told. And I'm really glad that you're talking about that. Clifford was talking about Bill Wilson, and you're talking about the significance of the Great Depression and FDR and all of this. We need to penetrate the history of our place and our country if we want, you could say, to christen our land. So I think I don't have much to say specifically on that because it would I think it would take us a little bit far afield, Loanne, but I'm really glad you brought that into the room here, so to speak. Any other questions before I go on? Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to take a moment here. I just want to be sure that, just a second. Yeah, I'm going to come back to this thought that there's a very important connection between 1933 and 2033, and that these 7 years that we are living in now are an opportunity to consciously prepare and work toward a metamorphosis of the karma of 1933 in 2033 and beyond. Obviously, placing these things in specific years is a little bit rigid. These things are taking place in the etheric in much larger time cycles, and yet there is also a reality to these years. But I really see the next 7 years as vitally important for a conscious metamorphosis of the karma of 1933. And so I want to come back to the picture that I gave of the tableau of 1933. And there's something we might really notice about this tableau, which is that on the one hand, something takes place that is so powerfully beautiful and significant, namely the advent of the second coming. And at the very same time, you could say the most extraordinary form of evil that the planet has ever seen also began to rise up. We can see the Anthroposophical Society like tossed to and fro, like the disciples on a boat in the sea, waves, the inability, the difficulty, the challenge to navigate this tension that we were just talking about between the higher and the lower. But let's remind ourselves about why this is so significant, that these two things happen together, right? Because Rudolf Steiner tells us that evil has a very important role in the modern world and in the ability of human beings to rise to an experience of Christ in the etheric. This encounter with evil, which in a way, when we talk about Bill W. and his experience of powerlessness in the face of his own habit body, this intense encounter with the part of himself that was utterly destructive. This is already a picture of this. And Rudolf Steiner points this out, right? Probably many of you have read this, that at the original mystery of Golgotha, it was death. It was death that had to be met, and that this humanity's awareness of death led them to the possibility of awakening to the deed of Christ, the transformation of death. And so Rudolf Steiner says, in the fourth epoch, the Christ impulse was born out of the forces of death for the salvation of mankind. We can say that we owe the new impulses that permeated mankind to the event on Golgotha. Thus, by a strange paradox, mankind is led to a renewed experience of the mystery of Golgotha in the fifth epoch through the forces of evil. Through the experience of evil, it will be possible for the Christ to appear again, just as he appeared in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, through the experience of death. And then Rudolf Steiner says, during the last week of his lecturing activity, he himself refers to the significance of the year 1933, this time not in connection with the second coming, as he did a number of years earlier. This time he says, quote, "The beast will be released from its captivity in the earth. Before the etheric Christ is recognized rightly by man, humanity must come to terms with the confrontation with the beast that comes out of the depths in 1933. You see, Rudolf Steiner was well aware of this tension and the incredible, like I just read from chapter 12 of the book of Revelation, the dragon rising up to swallow the child being born. But I want to add to this something that comes from another contemporary spiritual researcher that I consider also to be very significant. And that is something that comes from the writings of Josiah ben Aaron in Israel. And this concerns this question of the role of the Anthroposophical movement at this moment. And what Ben Aaron says, maybe some of you are aware of it, but I think he has come to something very significant. He says, yes, it's true at the earthly level, anthroposophy, the Anthroposophical Society, the movement in a certain way failed. It fell apart. It couldn't rise to the occasion in an earthly sense. It broke apart. And yet, he says that at a higher level, it was actually, let me put it this way, it was Rudolf Steiner and a whole group of his students, both living and dead, and both living and dead, who worked actively to make this second coming possible. So please remember that already 2,000 years ago, the incarnation, the life of Christ was only possible because a small group of human beings prepared it. Right? And Ben Aaron is saying, he's saying that at this time of the second coming in 33, once again, this time only a much larger group of human beings, and not only the anthroposophists, but certainly the anthroposophists played a very significant role in the spiritual world, making it possible that even while World War II was breaking out, Hitler was coming to power, nonetheless, the being of Christ could go through this powerful metamorphosis within the etheric body of the earth. So we have a kind of polarity between a fall of the Anthroposophical movement in an earthly sense, but in a supersensible reality, something very potent this community was able to help make happen. And of course, if Rudolf Steiner had lived, well, we know that Rudolf Steiner was trying through, you could say, his whole life to prevent the rise of Hitler. I mean, his whole life could be seen as trying to bring the true mission of Germany to expression instead of this false mission. So that Rudolf Steiner had to complete his life work in the spiritual world instead of on the earth. And this was partly because of this. Even while he was alive, the members couldn't really form the kind of vessel necessary for him to be on earth. Right? This is part of the mystery of the Christmas conference. That a vessel now needed to be held by the members for Rudolf Steiner to be active. So now I'm going to close by just giving you 4 pictures of what is a possible metamorphosis of the tableau of 1933. What is a possible tableau of 2033 to the degree we can rise to the occasion? Again, not only in these next 7 years, but in the next 7 years and beyond. And the first thing I'd like to point to is that basically if we look at Ben Aaron's picture, is that a vessel was created, but almost nobody on earth except highly evolved beings were really even aware of it. Most people in the Anthroposophical Society at that time were caught up in these incredible political turmoils. Yes, there was incredible work being done, but virtually nobody, very few people, let's put it that way, were necessarily consciously participating in the supersensible events of 1933 when the Christ being appeared in the etheric world. And the question one of the questions now is, can a much larger group of human beings consciously participate in this further intensification that wants to happen of the Christ impulse? Can we make good something that happened somewhat unconsciously and by grace, by the fact that Rudolf Steiner had to die and work in the spiritual world? Can we more consciously form a vessel for this intensification of the Christ impulse? That's the first thing. The second thing is what I pointed to at the beginning, this question of whether we can create a new culture of anthroposophy. And this is something that I will go into great detail in these next 2 talks that I've planned. What is this kind of new anthroposophy that's trying to arise, that is arising? This culture not of fragmentation, but this possibility that we can actually create a harmonious astral sheath as a movement with one another, with how we work together, how we bear anthroposophy together. So this is the potential metamorphosis of the tragic events of 1933. The third element is, I would say, precisely through all the incredible forms of evil of the 20th century, that we're in a position now to consciously recognize the incarnation of Ahriman, to perceive the different stratagems and agendas, And again, as Rudolf Steiner says, precisely through this encounter with evil, bring forth fresh Michaelic impulses within humanity. And I would say I already see this happening to a certain degree through, well, for example, the COVID phenomena. There's been an incredible effort by many people to understand what is the agenda working here. And many, many human beings around the planet, many of them with no connection to anthroposophy, have kind of woken up to the time, the significance of this time. And yeah, a kind of Michaelic awakening through the meeting with evil. Whereas Hitler, from a certain perspective, we could say, took everyone completely by surprise, everyone who wasn't really paying attention in the way someone like Rudolf Steiner was. And the fourth dimension is this. I think, is it possible? Whoops, sorry, I'm trying to move this image so that I can see what's here. There we go. Is it possible that we can also consciously make room for Rudolf Steiner to work again in our midst? And I want to be clear that I'm not, in saying this, I'm not proposing in any way what form this would take. Whether he's incarnate or not is not the important thing, whether he works publicly or privately. But you see, we've took on a karma, because then you could say back in 1925, or the events that led up to the death of Rudolf Steiner, we as a community couldn't actually make room really for Rudolf Steiner. We couldn't make room for him. And I say we, it doesn't really matter whether we were alive at that time or not, because we bear the karma. We've united our karma with this movement. And I think we have an opportunity, if we do the right preparatory work, that as we move towards 2033, we could at least, you could say, remove obstacles to Rudolf Steiner's more intensive work again on the earth, in whatever form that takes, in whatever communities that takes, whether or not he works in connection with the Anthroposophical movement or outside of it. It's not the important thing. It's that we make room for him as a compensatory deed for what took place in the past. So again, I'm going to stop here. I just want to say that in these coming 2 talks that I'm planning, I will share a lot more practical thoughts about what might this inner preparation for 2033 look like? What might this new anthroposophy that's emerging, what might that really be and look like? Yeah, I'll try to bring this into the practical, but tonight I just wanted to share, these pictures as a way of saying and pointing to these coming 7 years as perhaps a time period of extraordinary significance for humanity and for our own movement, our own ability to fulfill our pre-earthly responsibilities. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen again and open again for any questions or comments in the last few minutes that we have.
Brian, are you wanting to speak? I see you unmuted.
Robert, please tell us the dates of the next two talks.
I haven't set them yet, Linda, but I will send out a message soon.
Okay. Thank you.
But if you want to get that announcement, you need to be subscribed to my website, my Substack account. Oh yeah, and I said I would put that in the chat. So I'll do that now. So this is my website, which is on a platform called Substack. I apologize. You might have to join Substack in order to subscribe to my website. But once you subscribe, and that doesn't cost anything, then you will receive notifications of my talks and my workshops and my writings that I publish on that site. So I have to figure out the date still and announce these. So
Robert, you mentioned a couple of different people that you might give us the actual spelling. Pietro Archiati. Some of us may not be familiar.
yes,
And also
yes,
Yeshua Ben Aaron.
yes, I can write these also in the chat if you would like.
That would be good.
Yeah, Pietro Archiati's books I have two of them. One's called From Christianity to Christ, and one is called Reincarnation in Modern Life, both published by Temple Lodge. And I think they're quite extraordinary. Well worth reading. And then Josiah Ben Aaron, who I probably am not pronouncing his name properly. He has written a number of anthroposophical books, but to me, his most significant book was actually his first, which was simply called The Spiritual Event of the 20th Century. And this is his experience of the second coming to pass. He places great emphasis on the 12 years between 1933 and 1945. And he describes, this tableau in great detail. And I haven't kept up on all his writings, but I do highly recommend this book. And there is his spelling of his name. Yeah, and that book again is called The Spiritual Event of the 20th Century.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question, make a comment? Alice. You need to unmute, Alice.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Robert, for this presentation. And while you're going to bring two more presentations, as you say, of a practical nature, I just wanted to add tonight that very important rhythms of the foundation stone, and that in Dornoch itself, perhaps at the center, things took on their own karma, so to speak, kept its promise. But in the periphery, for instance, in Holland, Emil from Emihoven, they were very, along with Ita Wegman, they were very much wanting to see what this foundation stone was all about. And they took it up very seriously. And you can find, I think, that's a foundation stone for community building in the Anthroposophical Society, for the
Yes.
Anthroposophical Society, and especially in the rhythms over the 7 days, because there you really become aware of the reality of the Christ in the etheric world. And then Aharon also mentions, but this is also something that was created in 1919, that is the Esoteric Youth Circle, which was community building. And it
Yes.
didn't have anything to do with the society. It was something that was, you could say, a Michaelic impulse within the hearts and souls of human beings to create a substance, an etheric substance around the earth, and especially now with how many satellites roaring overhead and everything
Mhm.
else going on, that
Yeah.
where everyone can find the courage, the effort, and the will, let's say, to take part in this community, I think one would find a real substance beyond the society itself, but that attunes one to other persons, to the Michaelites in the world, so to speak, coming up with new ideas and helping Michael to inspire different people who have come to that abyss, as you spoke about, that
Yes.
they are reaching for new thoughts. The third thing I just wanted to add was I think the society could be much more open, much more aware of these different um, people or persons or movements or whatever going on that could relate to, for instance, agriculture or movement or education, that the society might become a place where people could meet each other, and not just anthropops, but really people really wanting to do different things, and where they could perhaps meet then the work of Rudolf Steiner and people in the practical movements, so to speak. Thank you
Yes.
again, Will.
Thank you so much, Alice. Yeah, I hope I didn't sound too negative about the Anthroposophical Society and those events. There's no question that the meditative and spiritual work of the Anthroposophical community at the time of Rudolf Steiner and after his death played a huge role in making it possible for the second coming to take place in spite of the rising up of the beast from the abyss. Um, and and we need to build on that. We need to go through further metamorphosis, like you said. And I think, one thing that really rings true from what you've said, like one of the great differences I noticed reading Rudolf Steiner versus reading secondary anthroposophical literature is that Rudolf Steiner is constantly talking about humanity. He's talking about the whole. He's talking about the state of humanity. And I do think to some degree we have to create our movement out of this sense of what's living in the wider world, what's living in human beings, and what do we need to do for the human beings of our time rather than just what we want to say push onto the world.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, beautifully said, Alice.
Well, if there's no one else, we might ask Carl to read that Calendar of the Soul again, and then let Robert get to sleep. This is 10:39 there.
Yes.
Okay. When out of worldwide spaces, the sun speaks to the human mind, and gladness from the depths of soul becomes in seeing one with light. Then, rising from the sheath of self, thoughts soar to distances of space and dimly bind the human being to the spirit's life.
Thank you.